It is Writing Wednesday, and I'm live. This is Janet Fitch, and I am live from my bat cave here on a beautiful autumn day, but that's the writer's life. And I have been having kind of a busy fall. Things have heated up again with my latest book, Chimes of a Lost Cathedral. I'll be at the Pasadena Central Library on the 14th, this Saturday. We'll be in Prescott, Arizona at the Yavapai College Writing Series on the 20th. And on the 27th and 28th, I'll be up at the Wrightwood Writing Festival. So I'll be Wrightwood Book Festival. So I'll be giving a craft talk, and I will be doing a reading. Hi, Camilla. We're doing you today. And then on the 10th of October, I will be with Renee Denfield with her new book, Butterfly Girl. Her last book was The Child Finder. And we will be talking about our books at Diesel bookstore on Los Angeles' West Side. That's the 10th. And so the beat goes on. So today I got a letter from a reader, Camilla, who is with us right now. And here's what Camilla asked. She says, I have a question. Is how not to write feel good. Basically, and put straight, I want to write serious and well-written fiction that touches people. I had some indications that my project can be perceived as feel good, and I guess that's a genre or something, capital F, feel good, which I interpret as easily digested, not very well written, and suitable for reading diagonally, speed reading, which I've never heard of reading diagonally. That sounds pretty interesting too. If it could be the case, but if so, I have things to learn. I'm not saying feel good doesn't play an important role in our world, but since I don't prefer to read it myself, I don't want to write it. The difference between feel good and fiction that goes deeper is kind of obvious, but at the same time, I suspect I'm missing something. Do you have any thoughts on the difference? Okay, this is a fantastic question. Years ago, I was doing some reviewing, and I was invited to review a book by a pretty famous writer who hadn't released anything in a while. And it was, I mean, she's a really good writer, but nothing happened in this thing. It was like every punch was pulled, meaning no blows landed, nobody got a big boo-boo, you know. There was no conflict. Everybody was behaved really well, and and then it was over. And I wouldn't even know what feel good as a genre means, except that I'd reviewed this book. And typically me, I have a hard time, a bad book is as hard to write as a good book. So, I don't like to light into people. I try to think more who would like a book like this, I don't know. Would I like to think about, okay, feel good? I never even knew that was a genre or type of writing or type of criticism. But I will say probably what the problem is that there's insufficient conflict. And if we talked about what drives a book, especially the dialogue scenes, is conflict between characters. One putting pressure on another. And every scene is a conflict scene. Otherwise, there's no movement. Nothing's happening. And when blows don't land, we have something that's not true. It's not real. So feel good. Everybody wants to feel good. If I'm sick, I go to bed, I want to read something that's going to make me feel better. But if it's bullshit, it's not going to make me feel better. It's going to make me feel like I've eaten a bag of Doritos. It's not nourishing. It's not a good meal. It's not well prepared. It's not interesting in any way. Maybe I won't want, really pungent flavors if I'm feeling not so great. But I'm certainly going to want a well-prepared meal, and not a bag of Doritos. I want to be able to think about it after it's done. I want to actually feel better. And you feel better if you are, somebody who, that's one of your intentions, in writing, is to make the reader feel better. You don't feel better being fed a bunch of junk. Nobody really feels better. They just feel like they've wasted time. That's not what you want. You want to be memorable. You want to end it in a way that's like, oh God, that was a good book. That's really feeling good, is when you finish a book and go, wow, now I can take a nap. When it's really great, that makes you feel good. And if you don't want to deal with subject matter that is harrowing, nobody says that every book has to be, The First Circle or the Gulag Archipelago. If you want to deal, even with comedic material, it still has to be true and resonant and feel real and have some layers and some depth to it, that you're using what you know about human life. What you have an antagonist who is truly an antagonist, whether it's comedic or not. I think that, so if you're, even if your goal was to make people feel better, which I don't think feel good books, I don't think that's what you're talking about. But you can certainly good books that really tell us something real about the world that we know, but we never saw on the page before. Things we've thought and never put it on the page before always makes people feel better, because they feel recognized, they feel accompanied, they'll laugh out loud just out of recognition. So it's getting away from what you've ever seen before on the page. So, if what you're seeing is something that can be categorized, and people are like, oh yeah, I know how this story goes. No, it has to surprise them. It has to, if there are no surprises, if you're going along a kind of standardized path, a type of novel that we've seen before, moves we've seen before, you need to always surprise the reader. And usually it's when we surprise ourselves. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know they were going to do that. But yeah, what can I do here that I haven't seen before? What's the thing everybody would do in this situation? And then purposely think, no, something else is going to happen. First thought is not the best thought. First thought is just the first thought. It's just the opening salvo. Feel-good literature is a genre in Sweden, Camilla says. But I am going to address this question because I have a really good feeling I know what they're talking about. So first, you see, if you're not intending to write a light book, the light book can be beautifully done, surprisingly done, wonderfully done, but it's always surprising And it arises from the specifics of character, the quirkiness of your characters as drawn, will, when pressure is put on their quirkiness, they will come up with weird solutions, weird moves. They'll do things that we are not expecting, and that itself will delight the reader. When they see something that they've thought or seen themselves but never kind of clicked into, and you have that on the page, you know, that will make people feel better. But be original, you know, and not just be able to be consumed like a bag of Doritos. You know, it'll be, wow, what a great taste that was. If you're not intending to write light fiction, comedic fiction, then the blows have to land. You know, we love our characters, but it's not up to us to protect the character. They're not people. They're not our children. They are there to teach us something, to let us follow them, to learn what happens when, you know, they decide to do some crazy thing, or not crazy, when they are under pressure. We see ourselves, and so it has to be real. It can't just be some fabrication that makes sure there's no conflict and nothing bad ever happens to people, because in life, bad things happen to people, and especially they happen to characters. You want the conflict between characters always to be running the show. And the stronger your antagonist is, the more real it is, because they've got to deal. Your main character has to deal with it. Feelgood is often superficial. You know, you don't get internals. You don't have any, your characters don't have necessarily have, in that kind of generic writing, they don't have thoughts that don't relate directly to what's in front of them. Whereas in real life, that happens all the time. You know, you're getting fired by your boss, and you remember something that happened when you were 7. And it might only obliquely relate to what is happening in the present. The mind can travel. You know, people can go anywhere in the imagination. They can remember something and be right back there. They can think about bigger issues. You know, feel good, I don't think has to do with mystery and crime, which is by nature not feel good. The whole point is getting down and gritty. So I don't think that really applies. In situations that are very realistic about real people, not not superheroes, not detectives, not a crime novel. You know, people have problems, and it's not just this one problem that is the spine of your book, but you know, they have conflicts in their personality. They have conflicts with other people that can be played. There we are. We're back. I do occasionally I'm having terrible electrical problems in my house. This is not a studio. This is my genuine house. And the electrician is on vacation for 2 more weeks. So we're going to deal with, that's what this format is so great, because it's DIY. And we just deal with things as they come. So feel good as a type of work. And this relates also to the question of ambition. You know, how good a book do you want to write? What kind of a writer do you want to be? You know, I have a firm belief that when I took archery in high school, they told you to always aim high, because if you aim high, you're going to hit something. Whereas if you aim low, you're going to hit the ground. So always aim high. Aim to write, you know, for the ages. And maybe you'll be, you know, fall somewhat short of that. But it won't be for lack of trying. And a good book whether it is a comedic book, whether it is dealing with tender emotions and wants to be, a small book, should also be moving, should also be a pleasure to read. And I it's hard for people who tend to perfectionism. It can be somewhat tricky to be extremely ambitious. But this is where you decide what kind of writer you want to be. Is it good enough for government work? Then you go for where you think people are going to be buying the Doritos. But if you care about the quality of what you're writing, if you even if you're writing light subject matter or comedic work, go for the fences, bat all the way. If it's comedic, make sure it's fresh, make sure that the turns you take are surprising, that the language is surprising and fun to read, that characters don't resemble each other. In comedic writing tends to the extremes. It does better when you have extreme differences between people. A lot of comedy can be generated that way. And sentimentality, we've talked about sentimentality. That's a real flaw. That book that I had reviewed years ago, The Conflict-Free Zone, the difficulty was that there were none of the blows landed, and there was nothing happened. There was no surprise. There was no danger. And the sentimentality, which is we're working off of emotion you don't really have, things that you haven't earned, emotion you haven't earned. If you think of sentimentality as emotion you haven't earned, then you can see the problem with Feelgood. It's like, oh, there's a bunny, that sentimentality. But it's like, oh, there's a kid who is sitting on a bus bench talking to themselves, swinging their arms, terrified of unseen dangers. That is not a bunny. That you can earn that sympathy, that sentiment about that person. You earn. You don't just, put in a few things, mildly threatening things, and then, oh, she works it out. Her stepson, her little toddler stepson, doesn't like her, and she doesn't have children, and she doesn't know what to do. I mean, that can be played softball, or that can be really played with a lot of truth and sting and unpleasantness and sudden surprise and thoughts of hitting the door. To put a few more corners, a little sharp edges in something like that, just to keep us real, is very helpful. So it not only goes deeper, the difference between feel good and, more considered literature. It goes deeper. It asks bigger questions. It feels free to digress in an interesting way. Characters take interesting directions. No scene should end the way the reader feels it's going to. So even if you want to challenge yourself, look at your beginning of your scene and say to yourself, how would the reader think this is going to turn out? And then make sure it does not turn out that way. So it's the writer putting pressure on him or herself, as well as the reader putting pressure on them. So I think hopefully this is very helpful. Suitable for reading diagonally. That's a problem of language, because you can eat a bowl of oatmeal really fast. But they're, a more interesting kind of prose, you just can't read that fast because something is actively going on in the sentence, and you have to slow down to really properly run your eyes over that language. Right now, my husband is reading The Sound of the Fury for the first time. And I'll tell you, he is a massively fast reader. Unbelievable. I mean, he's finishing a book a day. Boom, boom, boom. But he cannot whip through Sound of the Fury because the language is, it's more than crunchy. It is, it is so unusual that you have to read carefully like a poem to really get the sense of what the writer is saying. Now, that's something that is the level of difficulty of your writing difficulty. The level of texture, how heavy textured that language is that's a choice that the writer has to make for themselves. How much are they going to expect from the reader? And Mayakovsky famously said there is poetry for the producer and poetry for the consumer. And what he means is there's poetry that's there to inspire other poets who will take that time to understand, to slow down, to tease out, to appreciate the shape of it and the sound of it and the imagery, but especially in the one word up against the other. The fellow poets will take that time, whereas the consumer, especially during the Revolution in Mayakovsky's time, these were people who hadn't read very much at all, and when presented with poetry of the difficulty that Mayakovsky is talking about, they just would be lost. So there's a place for work that is understandable by everyone, and there's a place for work that is going to be understandable for the people who are really going to roll up their sleeves and slug it out. And you decide where on that scale you want to be. But even work for the consumer, quote unquote, for the average person, does not have to be oatmeal. You can just delight them by your imagery, by your use of language, but it's a choice of, readability, how readable. But readable doesn't mean boring. People can be highly readable and their language can be super good and interesting, and interesting word choices and interesting syntax. You have to know in yourself that's why having a muse is really good. How designers will have a muse, like Lulu de la Falaise was Yves Saint Laurent's muse. And what a muse does is set a style, they have a certain way of putting say in fashion, they have a certain style of putting themselves together, that the designer can be inspired, and the vision becomes unified because of who they're designing for would be this ideal person, their muse. People who have a muse as far as writing or creating visual art. choreographer will use a certain dancer who has a certain strengths and limitations, and they will make a work making the best of that person's style and abilities, you know, leaning towards what they're strong at. And if you think of your ideal, I mean, many people say, I don't write for anybody else, I only write for myself. So you're your muse. I think of my muse as often myself at a much younger age. I think of her reading it. I think of what her, you know, what she's looking for, what she's hungry for, the kind of writing that appeals to her. So that seems crazy, but I do that all the time. I have inner characters that I commune with, but I have certain other people in mind, often abstract, often people I don't know and will never meet, but I think of them when I'm writing, that the work would appeal to a person like that. So when you decide kind of the level of readability, the style, and how challenging it's going to be, you decide for yourself how I mean, my mentor, Kate Braverman, used to say, write for the 5 smartest people you know, which is a wonderful thing to do, is to imagine the 5 smartest people you know, and then to write to them. That is going to force you to write at the top of your ability. But sometimes that can get very meta, that can get very introverted. You know, if the 5 smartest people you know are all avant-garde poets, you are not going to be writing for the average person, you know? And if you just have to know that, and then not be, you know, furious when the average person can't dig it. So a lot of it is not only being ambitious, which I always hope that one will be, and not ambitious for, you know, for ambitious meaning, you know, I want to be in the bestseller list, I want to have a, you know, fancy car, blah, 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 carpet. Who cares about that? I mean, it means ambitious as a writer, you know, that you have ambition to maybe survive, your books last more than a season because people continue to read them. Maybe they'll be taught someday, if that's something that interests, that, you know, if that's the direction your ambition goes. If your ambition is to make people who haven't read much at all suddenly want to read more, and challenge them to, you know, not challenge them, but, you know, open up the world, crack it open. You know, that's an ambition. Make them aware of some, you know, social problem. That's an ambition. There's lots of ways to be ambitious. You know, I'm ambitious, you know, in a huge way. I look at the great writers and I'm just like, how do they do it? How do they do it? You know, this is how hard you have to work. These are the kind of things you have to address. This is the language that you have to equal. So you know, I have a big streak of that. Hi. So these are, you know, some of the issues around feel-good writing, that you don't really feel good when it's garbage. You feel like you just ate a bag of Doritos. And why in the world would you want to spend 2 years, 3 years, however long a novel takes you, writing garbage? You know, the world doesn't need it. Where's the, you know, you want, and Camilla, you don't want to do that, obviously. So these are some things that you make sure there's conflict, make sure there's language, see what kind of unusual moves your characters might make them a little more extreme, make them have more of internal conflicts. That will come out. So anything else I can answer for you? Well, I appreciate your you're reading me, listening to me, and I hope your writing goes well, and I will be back next week. All right, thank you. Bye.